What do you learn from that on the nature of happiness? What does it take to be happy?
Happiness is interesting because it's complex and multifaceted. It includes a lot of things that are out of your control and a lot of things that are in your control. And it's quite the moving target in life. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I one of the things that really impacted me when I was a young man and I read the Gulag Archipelago was don't pursue happiness because the ingredients to happiness can be taken from you outside of your control, your health, but pursue like a spiritual fullness, pursue, I think he words it, duty. And then happiness may come alongside or it may not. But so he gives the example that I thought was really interesting of in the prison camps,
Mhm.
everybody's trying to survive and they've made that their ultimate goal. I will get through this. And they've all basically turned into animals in pursuit of that goal and like lying and cheating and stealing. And then he was like, and somehow the corrupt Orthodox Church produced these little babushkas who were like candles in the middle of all this darkness because they did not allow their soul to get corrupted. And he's
Yeah.
like, what they did do is they died. They all died, but they were lights while they were alive and lost their lives, but they didn't lose their souls. So for myself, that was really powerful to read and realize that the pursuit of happiness wasn't exactly what I wanted to aim at. I wanted to aim at living out my life according to love, like we talked about earlier.
Trying to be that candle.
Trying to be that candle. Yeah, make that your ideal. And then in doing so is interesting. So for me personally, my personal experience of that is I thought when I went to Russia that I kind of gave up. I'm like in my 20s, I spent my whole 20s living in teepees and doing all this stuff that I thought I should be getting a job. I should be pursuing a career. I should get an education of some sort. Like, what am I doing for my future? But I felt I knew where my purpose was. I knew what my calling was. So I'm just going to do it. And it sounds glamorous now when I talk about it, but it sucked a lot of the times. And it was a lot of loneliness, a lot of like giving up what I wanted, a lot of watching people I cared about. You put all this effort in, and then you just see the people that you put all this effort in just die, and this and that, and then commits. It was that happened all the time. And then the other thing I thought I gave up was like a relationship because you couldn't. Uh, I wasn't going to find a partner over there. And so, interestingly enough, now in life, I can look back and be like, whoa, weird. Those two things I thought I gave up is where I've been like almost provided for the most in life. Now I have this career guiding people in the wilderness that I love. Like I genuinely love it. I find purpose in it. I know it's healthy and good for people. And then I have an amazing wife and an amazing family. Like, how did that happen? But I didn't exactly aim at it. I consciously, in a way, I mean, I hoped it was tangential, but I aimed at something else, which was those lessons I kind of got from the Gulag Archipelago.
So you have just because you if you mentioned Gulag Archipelago, I got to go there. You have some suffering in your family history, whether it's the Armenian Assyrian genocide or the Nazi occupation of France. Uh, Maybe you could tell the story of that. What this the survival thing? It runs in your blood, it seems.
I love history. Like, I find so much richness in knowing what other people went through and find so much perspective in my own place in the world. I have the advantage of in my direct family, my grandparents, yeah, they went through the Armenian genocide. They were Assyrians, which was it was like a Christian minority, indigenous people in the Middle East. They lived in northwestern Iran. And during the chaos of World War I, and the Ottoman Empire was collapsing and it had all kinds of issues. And one of its issues was it had a big minority group, and it thought it would be a good time to get rid of it. And they can justify it in all the ways you can. Like there's some people that were rebelling or this or that, but ultimately it was just a big collective guilt and extermination policy against the Armenians and the Assyrians and my grandparents. My grandma was 13 at the time, and my grandpa was 17, which is interesting because it happened almost 100 years ago. But just my dad was born when my grandma was pretty old. So, but my grandmother, her dad was taken out to be shot. The Turks were coming in and rounding up all the men, and they took them out to be shot. And then they took my grandma and her. She had 7 brothers and sisters and her mom, and they like drove her out into the desert. Uh, Basically, her dad got taken out to be shot, so his name was Shauman Umar or whatever. Took him out. They were all tied up, all shot. He said a quick prayer before they shot him, but he fell down and he found he wasn't hit. And usually, of course, they'd come up and stab everybody or finish him off. But there was some kind of an alarm, and all the soldiers rushed off. And he found himself in the bodies and was able to untie himself. They were naked and hungry and all that. And he ran out of there, escaped, went into a building, and found the loaf of bread wrapped in a shirt, and was able to escape. He fled. He never saw his family for. So to continue the story, my grandma got taken with her mother and brothers and sisters, and they just drove him into the desert until they died, basically, and run him around in circles and this and that, and then all the raping and pillaging that accompanies it. And at one point, her mom had the baby, and the baby died, and her mom just collapsed and said, "I just can't go any further." And my grandma and her sister like picked her up to we got to keep going, and like picked her up. And they left the baby along with everybody else had died. It was just the 3 of them left. And somehow they bumbled across this British military camp and were rescued. Neither the sister nor my great grandmother ever really recovered from what I understand, but my grandma did. At the same time, in another village in Iran, there the Turks came in and were burning down my grandpa's village, and my grandpa's dad was in a wheelchair, and he had like some money belt, and he stuffed all his money in it and gave it to grandpa and just told him to run and don't turn back. And they came in the front door as he was running out the back, and he never saw his dad again, but he said he turned around and saw the house on fire. Never knew what happened to his sister. So he was just alone. He ran. Yeah, at some point I can't remember, he like lost his money belt, and like he took his jacket off, forgot it was in it. Something happened. Anyway, so he was in a refugee camp. He ended up getting taken in by some Jesuit missionaries. So anyway, both of them had lost basically everything. And then at some point they met in Baghdad, started a family, immigrated to France. And then it just so happened to be right before World War II. And so then the Nazis invaded. My aunt, she's still alive, but she actually met a resistance fighter, for the French, and under a bridge somewhere, and they fell in love, and she got married. So she had kind of an in on the French resistance at one point. And of course, they were all hungry. They'd recently immigrated, but also had this Nazi occupation and all that. And so the Uncle Joe, the resistance fighter guy, told him like, "Hey, we're gonna storm this noodle factory. Like, come." And so they stormed the noodle factory, and all my aunts ran in there and were like throwing out noodles into wheelbarrows, and everybody was running. And then the Nazis came back and took it back over and like shot a bunch of people and everything. And Grandpa, because he had already come from where he came from, was paranoid, so he buried all the noodles out in the garden. And then my 2 aunts got stuck in that factory overnight with all the Nazi guards or whatever. And then the Nazi guards went all from house to house to find everybody that had noodles and, punish them. But they didn't find my grandpa's. Fortunately, they searched his house, but not the garden. And then, so they had noodles, and somehow it must have been in the same factory or something, but olive oil, and they just lived off of that for the whole war years. My aunts ended up getting out of they hid behind boxes and crates overnight and stuff, and the resistance stormed again in the morning, and they got away and stuff. But anyway, chaos. So when they moved to America, I will say the most patriotic family ever. They loved it. It's like paradise here.
I mean, that's a lot to go through. What lessons do you draw from that on perseverance?
Look, I'm just one generation away from all that suffering. Like my aunts and uncles and dad and stuff were the kids of these people, and somehow I don't have that. Like what happened to all that trauma? Like it's like somehow my grandparents bore it, and then they were able to build a family, but not just a family but a happy family. Like I knew all my aunts and uncles, and I didn't know them; they died before me. But it was so much joy. The family reunions were the best thing ever at the Jonases. And and it's just like, how in one generation did you go from that to that? And it
It,
must have been a great sacrifice of some sort to not pass that much like resentment, or like, what did they do to break that chain in one generation?
do you think it works the other way, like where their ability to escape genocide, to escape Nazi occupation, gave them a gratitude for life? So
Oh
it's
yeah.
not a trauma in the sense like you're forever bearing it. The flip side of that is just gratitude to be alive when you know so many people did not survive.
Yeah, it must be, because the only footage I saw of my grandma was like they were all had the kids and stuff, and they were cooking up a rabbit that they were raising or whatever, and uh, but a joyful woman, you could see it in her, and she must have understood how fortunate she was and been so grateful for it and so thankful for every one of those 11 kids she had. So I recognize it again in my dad, because my dad went through a really slow, kind of painful decline in his health, and he had diabetes, ended up losing one leg, and so he lost his job. He had to watch my mom go to school. All he wanted to do was be a provider and be like a family man. I bet the best time in his life was when his kids ran to him and gave him a hug. But then all of a sudden he found himself in a position where he couldn't work, and he had to watch his wife go to school, which was really hard for her, and become the breadwinner for the family. And he just felt like a failure. And I watched him go through that. After all these years of letting that foot heal, we went out first day, and we were splitting firewood with the splitter, and he was just, so good to be back out, Jordan. It's so nice. And he crushed his foot in the log splitter, and you're just like, no. And so then they just amputated it. We've got both legs amputated.
Wow.
And then his
Wow.
health continued to decline. He lost his movement in his hands. So he was like incapacitated to a degree and in a lot of pain. I would hear him at night in pain all the time. And I delayed a trip back to Russia and just stayed with my dad for those last 6 months. And it was so interesting, having had lost everything. I watched him wrestle with it through the years, but then he found his joy and his purpose just in being almost, I mean, a vegetable. I'd have to help him pee, help roll him onto the cot, take him to dialysis. But we would laugh. He would like, I'd hear him at night crying or like in pain, like, ah. And then in the morning, he'd have like encouraging words to say. And I was like, wow, that's how you face loss and suffering. And he must have gotten that somehow from his parents. And then, I find myself on this show, and I had a thought like, why is this easy to me in a way? Like, why is this thing and I was like, and it just felt like this gift that had kind of handed down, and now would be my duty to hand down, but it's kind of an interesting
And be the beacon of
thought.
that, represent that kind of perseverance in the simpler way that something like survival in the wilderness shows.
Yeah,
It's the same. It rhymes.
It rhymes, and it's so simple. Like, the lessons are simple, and so we can take them and apply them.
So that's on the survivor side. What about on the people committing the atrocities? What do you make of the Ottomans, what they did to Armenians, or the Nazis, what they did to the Jews, the Slavs, and basically everyone? What do you? Why do you think people do evil in this world?
I think it's interesting that it's really easy, right? It's really easy. You can almost sense it in yourself to justify a little bit of evil, or you see yourself cheer a little bit when the enemy gets knocked back in some way. It's really, in the way, it's just perfectly natural for us to feed that hate and feed that tribalism, in group, out group. We're on this team. And I think that can happen. I think it just happens slowly, like one justification at a time, one step at a time. You hear something, and it makes you think then that you are in the right to perform some kind of, you're justified and break a couple eggs to make an omelet type thing. And then, but all of a sudden that takes you down this whole train to where pretty soon you're justifying what's completely unjustifiable.
So it's gradual.
Yeah.
It's a gradual process of a little bit at a time.
I think that's why, like, for me, like, having a path of faith is like works as like a mooring because it can help me shine that light on myself. It's like something outside. Because if you're just looking at yourself and looking within yourself for your compass in life, it's really easy to get that thing out of whack. But you kind of need a perspective from which you can step out of yourself and look into yourself and judge yourself accordingly. And am I walking in line with that ideal? And I think without that check, you're subject. It's easy to ignore the fact that you might be able to commit those things, but we live in a pretty easy, comfortable society. Like, what if we pictured yourself in the position of my grandparents, and then all of a sudden you got the upper hand in some kind of a fight? What are you gonna do? You definitely picture becoming evil in that situation.
I think one thing faith in God can do is humble you before these kinds of complexities of the world. Mm-hmm. And humility is a way to avoid the slippery slope towards evil, I think. Humility that you don't know who the good guys and the bad guys are.
Mm-hmm.
And you defer that to sort of bigger powers to try to understand that.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of the atrocities were committed by people who are very sure of themselves being good.
Yeah, that's so true.
It is sad that religion is at times used as a way to kind of as yet another tool for justification.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which is a sad application of religion.
It really is. It's so inherent and so natural in us to justify ourselves. It's really, I think it's almost, just understanding history, read history, it blows my mind that, and I'm super thankful that somehow, and this has been misused so much, but somehow this ideology arose that love your enemies, forgive, forgive those that persecute you, and just on down the line, that something like that rose in the world into a position where we all kind of accept those ideals, I think is really remarkable and worth appreciating. That said, a lot of that gets wrapped up in what you're talking, what is so natural just becomes another instrument for tribalism or another justification for wrong. And so I even myself am self-conscious sometimes talking about matters of faith, because I know when I'm talking about something else other than, everybody than what someone else might think of when they hear me talking about it. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I've been listening to Jordan Peterson talk about this. He has a way of articulating things, which are sometimes hard to understand in the moment, but when I read it carefully afterwards, it starts to make more sense. I've heard him talk about religion and God as a kind of base layer, like a metaphorical substrate from which morality of our sense of what is right and wrong comes from, and just our conceptions of what is beautiful in life. All these kinds of higher things that are fuzzy to understand, that their religion helps create the substrate from which we as a species, as a civilization, can come up with these notions. And without it, you are lost at sea. I guess for him, morality requires that substrate.
Like you said, it's kind of fuzzy. So I've only been able to get clear vision of it when I live it. It's not something you profess or anything like that. It's something that you take seriously and apply in your life. And when you live it, then there's some clarity there. But that it has to be kind of defined. And that's where you come in with the religion and the stories, because if you leave it completely undefined, I don't really know where you go from there. I actually, to speak to that, I did mushrooms. Have you ever done those before?
Mushrooms, yeah.
I've done them a couple times, but one time didn't do that many. The other time more. And I had a really profound experience in helping couch all this in a proper context for myself. So when I did it, I remember I was sitting on a swing and I could see everything was so blissful, except I could see my black hands on these chains, on this swing, but everything else was blissful and kind of amorphous.
Mhm.
And I could see the outline of my kids,
Mhm.
and I could just feel the love for them. And I was just like, man, I just feel the love. It's so
Mhm.
wonderful. Why, but then I would, at times I would try to picture them, and I couldn't quite picture the kids, but I
Mhm.
could feel the love. And then I started asking all the deepest existential questions I could, and it felt like I was just one answer, another answer, another answer. Everything was being answered, and I felt like I was communing with God, whatever you want to say. But I was very aware of the fact that communing was just peeling back the tiniest corner of the infinite, and it just dumped me with every answer I felt like I could have, and it kind of blew me away. So then I asked it, well, if you're the infinite, like, why did you reveal to me yourself? Why did you use like the story of Jesus to reveal yourself? And then that infinite amorphous thing had to somehow take form for us to be able to relate to it. It
Mhm.
had to have some kind of a form. But whenever you create a form out of something, you're like boxing it in
Mhm.
and subjugating it to boundaries and stuff like that. And then that subject to pain and subject to the brokenness and all that. And I was like, oh, wow. And then, but when I had that thought, then all of a sudden I could relate my like dark hands on the chains to the rest of the experience. And then
Mhm.
all of a sudden I could picture my children as the children rather than this amorphous feeling of love. It was like, oh, there's Alana and Altai and Zaya. But then they were bounded, and then once they're bounded, you're subject to the death and to the misunderstanding and to the all that. And I was,
Mhm.
like, I picture the amoeba or the cell, and then when it dies, it turns into a unformed thing. And so we need some kind of form to relate to. So instead of always just talking about God completely intangibly, it kind of gave me a way to relate to it. And I was like, oh wow, that was really powerful to me, and putting it in a context that was applicable.
But ultimately, God is sort of the thing that's formless, that
Right.
is unbounded.
Right.
But we humans need. I mean, that's the purpose of stories. They resonate with something in us.
Mhm.
But when you need the sort of the bounded nature, the constraints of those stories,
Mhm.
otherwise we wouldn't be able to
Can't relate to it.
can't relate to it.
Yeah, yeah.
And then when you look at the stories literally, or you just look
Mhm.
at them just as they are, it seems silly,
Mhm.
just too simplistic.
Right, right. And then that was always, all my, a lot of my family and loved ones and friends have completely left the faith. But I totally, in a way, I get it. Like I understand, but I also really see the baby that's being thrown out with the bathwater, and I want to cherish that in a way, I guess.
And it's interesting that you say that the way to know what's right and wrong is you have to live it. Sometimes it's probably very difficult to articulate, but
Mhm.
in the living of it, do you realize it?
Yeah, and I'm glad you say that, because I found a lot of comfort in that, because I feel somewhat inarticulate a lot of the times and
Yeah.
unable to articulate my thoughts, especially on these matters.
Hmm.
And then you just think I just have to, but I do have to. I can live it. I can try to live it. And then what I also am struck with right away is I can't, because you can't love everybody. You can't love your enemies, and you can't. Um, but as placing that in front of you as the ideal is so
Hmm.
important, to put like a check on your human instincts, on your tribalism, on your uh I mean, you can very quickly, like we talked about with evil, it can really quickly take its place in your life. Almost You almost won't observe it happening, but and so I so much appreciate all the me striving. And that's where, I grew up in a Christian family, so I had these like cliches that I didn't really understand, like a relationship with God. Like, what does that mean? But then I realized when I struggled with I actually did try to take it seriously and struggle with what does it mean to live out a life of love in the world. But that's like a wrestling match, because it's not that simple. It sounds good, but it's really hard to do. And then you realize you can't do it perfectly, but in that struggle, in that wrestling match, is where I actually sense that relationship. And that's where it kind of gains life and how that really, and that, I'm sure that relates to what Jordan Peterson is, getting at in his metaphor.
Yeah, in the striving
Right.
of the ideal, in the striving towards the ideal, you discover the how to be a better person.
One thing I noticed really tangibly on Alone was that because I had so many people that were close to me kind of just leave it all together, I was like, I could do that. I actually understand why they do,
Mhm.
or I could not. I do have a choice. And so I had to choose at that point to maintain that ideal. And because I could add enough time on Alone, the one nice thing is you don't have any distractions. You have all the time in the world to go into your head.
Yeah.
And I could play those paths out in my life. And not only in my life, but I feel like societally and generationally, like I'd throw it all away and everybody start from square one, or we can try to, redeem what's valuable in this and wrestle with it and so I chose that path.
Well, I do think it's a kind of wrestling match because you mentioned Gulag Archipelago.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very much a believer that we all have the capacity for good and evil,
Mm-hmm.
and striving for the ideal to be a good human being is not a trivial one. You have to find the right tools for yourself to be able to be the candle, as you mentioned before,
I like that.
and for that, religion and faith can help. I'm sure there's other ways, but I think it's grounded in understanding that each human is able to be a really bad person and a really good person. And that's like a choice. It's a deliberate choice. And it's a choice that's taken every moment and builds up over time. And and the hard part about it is you don't know. You don't always have the clarity using reason to understand what is good and what is right and what is wrong. You have to kind of live it with humility and constantly struggle. Because then, yeah, you might wake up in a society where you're committing genocides,
Mm-hmm.
and you think you're the good guys, and I think you have to have the courage to realize you're not. It's not always obvious,
It isn't, man.
and
But
only history has the clarity to show who were the good guys and who were the bad guys.
right, you gotta wrestle with it. It's like that quote, the line between good and evil goes through the heart of every man, and we push it this way and that. And our job is to work on that within ourselves.
Yeah, that's the part. That's what I like. Sort of the full quote talks about the fact that it moves. It moves from the line moves moment by moment, day by day. We have the freedom to move that line. So it's like it's a very deliberate thing. It's not like you're born this way and that's it.
Yeah, I agree.
And especially in conditions that are like war and peace. In the case of the camps, absurd levels of injustice in the face of all that. When everything is taken away from you, you still have the choice to be the candle, like the grandmas.
Yeah.
By the way, the grandmas in like all parts of the world are like the strongest
Shout out
humans.
to the grandmas. Seriously.
It's like I don't know what it is. I don't know. They have this like wisdom that comes from patience and have seen it all, have seen all the bullshit of the people that come and gone, all the abuses of power, all of this. I don't know what it is. And they just keep going.
Right.
It's just,
Yeah, that's so true.
what do you think of, as we've gotten a bit philosophical, what do you think of Werner Herzog's style of narration? I kind of wish he narrated my life.
Yeah, it's amazing to listen to.
Because that documentary is actually in Russian. I think he took a longer series.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then put narration over it.
Mm-hmm.
And that narration can transform like a story.
Yeah, he does an incredible job with it. I will say, have you seen the full version? Have you watched the 4-part full version? You should. You'd like it. It's in Russian, and so you'll get the fullness of that. And it's he had to fit it into a 2-hour format. And so I think what you lose in those extra couple hours is worth watching. I think you'll like it. So
Yeah, they always go pretty dark.
do they?
He has a very dark sense about nature, that it's violence and it's murder.
Yeah. I
And
think that's important to recognize, because it's really easy. I mean, especially with what I do and what I talk about, and I see so much of the value in nature. Gosh, I also see like a beautiful moose and a calf running around, and then next week I see the calf ripped to shreds by wolves, and you're just like, oh. And it's not as it's not as Rousseauian as we'd like to think. It is. Things must die for things to live, like you said, and that's just played out all the time, and it's indifferent to you. Doesn't care if you live or die.
yeah,
And doesn't care how you die or how much pain you go through while it's like, it's pretty brutal. So that it's interesting that he taps into that, and I think it's valuable because it's easy to idealize in a way, but
yeah, the indifference is, I don't know what to make of it. There is an indifference. It's a bit scary. It's a bit lonely.
mm-hmm,
You're just a cog in the machine
mm-hmm.
of nature.
I think
That doesn't really care about you.
totally. I think that's something I sat with a lot on that show. Is another part of the depths of your psychology to delve into. And that's when I thought, like, I understand that deeply, but I could also choose to believe
Yeah,
that for some reason it matters.
That's
and
right.
then I could live like it matters. And then I could see the trajectories. And that was another fork in the road of my path, I guess.
What do you think about the connection to the animals? So in that movie, it's with the dogs,
Mm-hmm.
and with you, it's the other domesticated, the reindeer. What do you think about that human animal connection?
In the context of that indifference, isn't it interesting that we assign so much value and love and appreciation for these animals, and in some degree we get that back in a reciprocate? I think right now you just said the reindeer, and I think of the one they gave me because he was long and tall, so they named him Dleeny, and and I just remember Dleeny and just watching him eat the leaves and go with me through the woods and trust him to take me through rivers and stuff, and it really is special. It's really enriching, to have that relationship with an animal. And I think it also puts you in a proper context. One thing I noticed about the natives who live with those animals all the time is they relate to life and death a little more naturally. It feels, we feel really removed from it, particularly in urban settings. And I think when you interact with animals and you have to confront the life and the death of them and the responsibility of symbiotic relationship you have, I think it opens a little bit of awareness to your place in the in the puzzle and puts you in it rather than above it.